Hello everyone, welcome to Allied's YouTube channel. Thank you for being present here with us today. As you might already know, Allied stands for Allies for Leading, Learning and Education of Disabilities. Here, we foster different topics related to disabilities in and around the campus. This week, we're diving deep into empowering world of neurodiversity in STEM. Join us for an insightful roundtable with Dr. Christin Monroe, an expert in chemistry and inclusive education. Dr. Monroe, a Princeton graduate and faculty member at the Landmark College, has years of experience supporting neurodivergent students and underrepresented groups. We'll explore how Landmark College uniquely empowers students in life sciences and computer science without accommodations, highlighting strategies to make STEM truly inclusive. Thank you for being with us today. We make all our events accessible with the assistance of ASL interpreters. Sit back and enjoy. Hello everyone, let's start the event. So I'm Fareen Zubair, the project manager for Allied. And let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you. Thank you for being present here today. And welcome Christine. So Christine is a faculty at Landmark University, and she's been a faculty for 4.5 years. And this is a university solely for neurodivergent individuals. And let me also take this opportunity to welcome our founder of Allied, Professor Moonamin Kara, and our co-founder, Dr. Sandra Scheffelbein. And today we have two ASL interpreters who will be assisting us. Welcome Andrea and Amy. So Amy will go first, and every 15 minutes we are going to be changing our ASL interpreters. Both our ASL interpreters are nationally certified. So before I begin the event, let me tell you a little about our speaker for today. Christin Monroe holds a PhD in chemistry from Princeton University and has served as a faculty member for 4.5 years at Landmark College, a college that solely serves neurodivergent students. She currently manages a STEM project for the Life Science and Computer Science program. She also serves as a mentor for undergrads for both science education and chemistry projects. Dr. Monroe is an active member of the American Chemical Society, currently serving as the secretary to the Green Mountain local section, and has delivered over 20 presentations related to student learning and STEM outreach. She has an extensive background working with historically underrepresented groups in STEM fields, including low-income, first-generation, and neurodivergent students. Today, she is here to talk about how Landmark College's approach empowers neurodivergent students without the need for accommodation and discover strategies to create inclusive environment. Thank you, Christine, for collaborating with us. So I would like to pass it on to
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my background. Then I'm going to go through some definitions and then talk about the strengths-based approaches we use at Landmark, and then a little bit about the inclusive content and environment that we create at Landmark, and then some final tips and takeaways, and then I'll open up for questions. And feel free to, ask questions along the way as well. This is pretty informal. I just like to have slides because it helps me. So go to the next slide, please. So first I'll start with my personal journey. Next slide. So I grew up in New Jersey, in Hunterdon County, which you can see the little house there that's kind of in the center. There is a Central Jersey, just in case you were curious. A lot of people don't realize that, but there is. That's where I grew up. There are more deer than people where I grew up as well. So Jersey does have its rural areas. And my high school was Rutgers Prep, which is in the county next to it. But I also grew up in China. So from the age of 2 to 6, I lived 2 years in Hong Kong and 2 years in Beijing. So that kind of surprises people. So I like to include that in my background as well. Next slide. So I got my BS in biochemistry from Misericordia University, which is in Dallas, Pennsylvania, with a minor in mathematics. I should say I put the highlight to my high school because I actually failed my first chemistry class in high school. And I ended up having a really good mentor who actually got his PhD from Princeton, who kind of took me under his wing and helped me to kind of reset myself with chemistry and really learn the language. And so I decided to go to college for biochemistry, originally thinking about going to vet school, but then because everything seemed to be working with chemistry and I had the right mentors and I couldn't really find the mentoring that I needed for vet school, I decided to pursue chemistry in graduate school, and took me about 8 years to get my PhD. That time was really about soul searching. I realized that I was more inclined to do science outreach and more non-traditional things than traditional things. And then at Landmark, I've also earned 2 graduate certificates, which I just figured I'd throw on there too. But I'll talk a little bit about life after Princeton and then Landmark in a little bit. So you can go to the next slide. So I went ABD, which is all but dissertation, for a year. I had a job lined up and I thought I was going to be done, but then I needed a little bit more time on my dissertation. So I did take that sort of gap time, but I started working at an upward bound program. It was a math science upward bound program in New Hampshire. And I applied to about 100 jobs across the country. I really wanted to just find a science outreach type of job. So I was there for 2.5 years, but what I soon realized is that it wasn't quite the right fit. But again, I had some really good mentors who said, maybe this isn't the right fit for you, but let's help you to explore and maybe find something that's a better fit. And so they suggested that I start adjuncting at Keene State. And so I was an adjunct in that department for a year. And then the pandemic happened. And then I decided, you know what, let me just change jobs because who's not good. So I started at Landmark in 2020. I started as a visiting professor, and basically I saw the job description for Landmark and I thought, that's a really interesting college. I never really wanted to be a professor, but I figured, the non-traditional learning environments at Landmark would be a good fit for me because I'm not really a big fan of lecturing. I like really engaging with students, and developing lifelong relationships with students, as you can see from the student who's online and the student who came today. And so after a year, I became an assistant professor, and then after another year, I inherited a $1.2 million NSF grant. So just lighting it right up. And I'll talk a little bit about that grant in a couple slides. So next slide. So you guys already know about Landmark. It was established in 1985 as the first institution to solely serve neurodivergent students. For context, that gives you kind of a lay of the land of where it lies in the state of Vermont, in that southern tip of Vermont. Next slide. So a couple definitions. When I talk about neurodiversity, I kind of like to distinguish between neurodivergent and neurodiversity. So when you think about neurodiversity, if you kind of picture a bell curve, the center of the bell curve is the average, and most people fall within the center. When you're considered to be neurodivergent, you are falling on the edges of the bell curve, both above and below in terms of skills and abilities. And so if you kind of picture in the middle of the bell curve, kind of like a house that holds most people, the world was designed for people that fall in the center of that bell curve. But so kind of adapting to the world in a way that wasn't necessarily designed for you is kind of what neurodivergent individuals likely have to face. Next slide. And I like to give that context. I will also say that language is a very personal thing. A lot of students at Landmark do choose to use disability first language because it is a large part of their identity. And acknowledging that neurodiversity is a cultural movement, I think it's important to just kind of acknowledge that and consider it. I tend to flip back and forth because Landmark is kind of a bubble, and we're a very inclusive environment. And so, I just want to clarify that if I do end up using disability first language, it's not out of disrespect or anything. It's just kind of like that culture that we have at Landmark. And a lot of students do end up doing that. Next slide. And so, some people talk about being neurodivergent as not being a disability, which I kind of push back on because there can be times when someone who's neurodivergent might not appear to have a disability, especially because it isn't visible. But it's important to recognize that there's a lot of stuff going on below the surface, and that neurodivergent individuals have developed skills to mask. And it's sensible for them to mask because they've been in environments that aren't necessarily inclusive of their differences. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there are times when their disability isn't present, but it doesn't mean that it's not there, and they might be actually taking a lot of cognitive load to pretend like everything is okay. And so, just I think it's important to kind of distinguish that and recognize that there are differences, and also considering that not looking at disability as a bad thing, but just looking at it as being different and having to again adapt to a world that isn't fully designed for you. Next slide. I always start my talks with a disclaimer just to say that, I don't think that anything that I do is intended to solve all problems with accessibility. And these are suggestions, and it's you really have to consider how to adapt it to yourself, to the content you teach if you're teaching, or your environment, and to the people that you're around. Because I think that sometimes people sort of say, oh, well, this is the best strategy. It's you got to adapt it to yourself. So I like to start off with that, especially because I've been to a lot of accessibility talks that are super intimidating, and you're kind of like, oh my God, this is so much to incorporate. It's just, figure out small things to incorporate. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about strengths-based approaches at Landmark. So all students take a perspectives and learning course at Landmark, which is really strengths focused. We really try to shift that deficit mindset. We take it one step further. One of the original professors who developed the perspectives and learning course is actually my PI, Rebecca Maddie, on this grant, AIE STEM Plus. And so it's from the National Science Foundation. It's funding to target low-income, academically talented, in our case, neurodivergent students, because all of our students are neurodivergent in computer science and biology. We want to create a robust culture of mentorship and provide opportunities for professional development for our scholars. Next slide. But it's so much more than a scholarship. They do get a scholarship, but it's the collegiality. So I have a picture of students that are clinking glasses. We had a mocktail event where students had to identify their strengths when putting together mocktails. That was super fun. We did splash chocolate milk all over the room. That's okay. We cleaned it up. And then, students working in the lab in lab coats, with big smiles on their faces. And then we've got our computer science folks. I asked them what they did when they were, because I don't really know what a computer science major looks like when they're doing their work. So that was the picture. They showed me what they do.
What do they do?
They sit at a computer. They also tend to put their head on their hands on their head a lot and have frustration. Yeah. Those are some of the other pictures that we took that didn't end up in the slide deck. But yeah, so there's a little frustration there too. But next slide. So all students at Landmark get a designated academic advisor, and so I have a Venn diagram kind of showing the overlap we have that our STEM scholars get. And so our STEM scholars are also directly connected with career connections counselor. Every Landmark student can have one, but we are more deliberate about connecting them and making sure they know, who career connections is. And then they also get a faculty mentor. We also do peer mentoring in our cohort class. So for once a week, for an hour, we all meet together on Wednesday afternoons, and we just kind of talk. I mean, a lot of times students share about their experiences and help to it's a group of scholars that are coming in from all different experience levels. So it's their first time in the course. Some have been in the course for several semesters because each semester they earn a credit. And even when students are done with the class, and even when students aren't earning credits for it, they still show up. And so we have a little bit of a not a cult. It's not a cult. They don't. But we joke that it kind of is. But we have a lot of different elements to the program. We talk about financial literacy, we do individualized development plans, but really it's just about being around each other and having that dedicated space to solely think about their futures. A lot of the students that I work with, and I'll talk about this in future slides, have executive function challenges. And so they're, it's not uncommon for them to fall behind in their work. And so that's hard for them to think about their future when they're struggling to keep up with the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So that 1 hour a week carves out that time for students to think about their futures. Next slide. We also use, so the strengths-based approach we use is the Berkman. The Berkman is a personality survey tool that really identifies things that motivate you, and also what your stress behaviors look like. And what is very common for our students to actually take the Berkman language and to put it on their description in LinkedIn, or to use it to actually describe themselves during interviews. And what is really nice about it is it takes some of the things that might be perceived as deficits, some of their like differences in terms of being neurodivergent, and it gives them language to highlight their strengths and to explain their ideal environments. And it also, one of the things that is really nice about this too is that it focuses on, is the environment a good fit or not, rather than, is the student doing something wrong and they aren't in the right environment. It's about shifting that focus and saying, maybe it's just not the right environment for them. And if they find the right environment, then they can really thrive. Next slide. So this was actually an activity that we did with our students. We had them take some of the descriptors of the stereotypes of neurotypes and had them reframe with the Berkman language. And so I'll just read a couple. Poor memory, forgetful. And then they say, for Berkman, needs a background of familiarity and support. In terms of ADHD and restlessness, is stimulated by novelty and adventure. So you can see how just reframing things and finding a better environment can really be helpful. Next slide. You can jump through these slides. So basically, I just wanted to highlight that there are other strengths-based approaches that can be used as well. Clifton Strengths is one of them. You can go to the next slide. And then it just basically breaks down the strengths into executing, influencing, relationship building, and strategic thinking. And then there's a deeper dive into those. But it's not necessarily limited to that. And so we just actually wrote a blog for the National STEM organization. And so if you want to check out more information about what we're doing with the Berkman, you can scan that QR code or shoot me an email, and I have my contact information at the end as well.
I'll share that.
Okay. So yeah, next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about neuro-inclusive pedagogy in my classes. So as I mentioned, a lot of our students do tend to have executive function challenges. It's not, a guarantee that you're going to have an executive function challenge. And I should also mention that not all students at Landmark have a diagnosed learning difference, but they might have demonstrated executive function challenges. We talked about Brown's model at Landmark that was originally developed focusing on ADHD. But what I really like about the model is that you can look at it and you can kind of see like, okay, these are kind of the steps, and this is where someone might get stuck. So I like to say that my students have a high activation energy, because activation is one of the things that they might struggle with, but then, so getting started with projects, but then sustaining that effort or managing frustration. You can go to the next slide. So I was talking to my dad one day and I said, could you give me an example of executive function challenges outside of the classroom? And he said, well, yeah, it's like when I polish stones. So he's been polishing stones since he was in high school. And so, you can roughly estimate my age. So it's been a long time. He ended up becoming an accountant, but this has always been his hobby. And so he really likes collecting rough rocks and polishing the stones, but he doesn't have a lot of completed stones because he really struggles with metalwork because he's not as confident with the metalwork. And so we've got piles of rocks and polished rocks, but not a lot of complete jewelry. And, there I would say that he struggles with managing frustration and it's also that perfectionist piece of things. I have so many students that won't turn in work because it's not done. And they're really anxious about being judged, and they would rather get a 0 with no judgment than a grade. And so, if my dad was being graded on his on his jewelry making, he probably wouldn't pass, even though I'm biased, but I think that the rocks look pretty awesome. So next slide. So one of the things that I do at Landmark is I have flexible deadlines. And so I have 3 examples of alarm clocks. There's one that with suggested deadlines, which has a smiling alarm clock. So if you get it in by the suggested deadline, which is in line with the course content, you're good. 2 weeks after that, I put placeholder zeros in the grade book. I really de-emphasize grades. I don't formally use ungrading, so I still have grades, but I like to put those zeros in so the students know that the things are missing. But the assignments can still be submitted until the middle and end of semester. I don't have complete flexibility with deadlines because I think that at some point they get so bogged down with like too many assignments and they don't know where to get started or where to. And so I have the mid-semester cutoff to have a realistic conversation about where the student stands with their grade. That's when the grade becomes real. And also so that, if they are behind, they kind of get that reset mid-semester, which I found to be very helpful too. Next slide.
What do you mean by automatic grading? Flexible grading and automatic grading.
So I actually have a lot. So most of the assignments that I have are either graded by an online platform from a publishing company or videos. And so I don't actually do a lot of the grading. And having the flexibility with having the grading done by the computer.
That allows you to have movable deadlines.
Yeah.
Because it's not you.
Yeah. And I've actually had students that kind of said, why can't other professors do this? I'm like, well, you have to have the right tools and you have to have, and again, it's personalized to the professor, but when I first started at Landmark, I wasn't using automatic grading and I was grading all the time. I never had any time to do anything other than grade. And I was getting really frustrated grading something from week 2 and week 7, and it was just a mess. But having the automatic grading really allows me to have that flexibility. So in terms of transparency, Landmark has a warning system. So if a student falls below a certain grade, there's really no concrete threshold for it. But if you see that they're kind of an outlier on the lower end of things, you can submit a warning that will go to their whole academic team. And I don't like to submit those until the student has a heads up. So I'll send pre-warning emails to them and their advisor and just say, hey, if you spend the weekend catching up on my assignments, then you won't be in bad shape. But because the warnings also, if the student has signed has given permission, the warnings may also go to their parents. And sometimes that is a double-edged sword because sometimes it ends up creating more anxiety rather than, but the warnings are written in a way that's if you just do these things and meet these deadlines, then, you'll be in good shape. But the connotation of it isn't always good. I also will print out lists of missing work. I don't want my students to not do well in my class because they don't know that they're missing an assignment. I give essentially 2 assignments per class, one that's done during class and one that's done outside of class. And so, that gets to be a lot. And so it's easy for me to just pull out I call it my highlighter of hope. I used to call it the highlighter of doom, but then I thought that, students didn't always appreciate that. But it takes me less than 10 minutes to do that. And I know my class better than the students do and the advisors do. That's an easy thing for me to do. And I've also started including learning objectives for tests. I know that a lot of students do tend to struggle with reading. We know as a whole, our students aren't doing reading. And so what I end up doing is I'll assign a video with suggested reading. And I suggest that they have the reading opened and they watch the video and there's embedded questions. But that can help them to explore the content without actually having to sit and read word for word. And it is also more interactive as well because they get the visual and audio cues. And if they need more information, then they can go to the book. And so it's a more functional type of reading. They don't always have to go to the book, but they have that as an additional resource. Next slide. So the platforms that I use for automatic grading are iClicker and Achieve. During class, I have iClicker questions that gauges the students' knowledge in real time. What's nice is, we have super small class sizes at Landmark. I don't use iClicker, actually, it's not graded, I should say that, but it helps me to pace myself. I tend to talk fast, as you might have seen. And so this allows me to kind of say, oh, do I need to spend more time on this? And it allows me to kind of see, okay, you know what, if students need another minute or 2 to answer a question, then I can give them that flexibility. So I use a flipped classroom method. So the students get to see the video ahead of time. Ideally, they don't always watch it ahead of time, to be fair. But then I do a short lecture. And then most of the time the students are working on Achieve, which is just an automatic grading platform. And it allows for more of that self-pacing and personalized experience. The grades are recorded as they go. And so I don't have to worry about a student that does half of a worksheet and gets frustrated, leaves the room, doesn't turn it in, and then I never see it again, and I have to give them a 0. That it's recorded as they go, and then they can get a sense of how they're doing in real time as well. Especially if they're nervous about asking questions, it allows for more of that interactive thing. And now Chief actually has an AI that will engage with the students as well, because sometimes they need an alternative explanation than the professor, and so that's another way to do that. Next slide. And then I think that AI can also be an accessibility tool. I know you can't really see it, but this is just an example of AI prompts that I provided to some of my students to help them get started on an activity. This was for a class that, called The Magic of Chemistry. And the goal, it's a non-majors class, but the goal is to have the students identify a popular culture reference that's scientifically inaccurate. And you'd be surprised, a lot of students can't figure out what that is. And so the first time I taught it was in person, and a lot of the students went to the tutoring center. I taught it online this summer, and they had access to the tutoring center, but it wasn't as readily available. So I thought, let's try to have AI be a tutor to help them and to identify topics, because I'm not assessing whether they can identify a topic. I'm asking, my assessment is, what are they doing as a result of that? So I don't want them to get stuck for that, but then also being transparent about how was AI used. Not every student did use AI, but it's good to follow up with them and say, could you explain to me how you used it? So yeah, next slide. And then a couple examples of some inclusive content, which I did bring some tactile models. So I've got here this Bohr model. So in the center, you can put a cup, and then you have marbles that represent protons, neutrons, and electrons. This was actually developed by Cindy Tolman, who was the previous chemistry instructor at Landmark. And I ended up presenting this at the Inclusion in Science Learning in a New Direction conference, which is where I met, I had already known Dr. Carrie Sapalo, but we started talking about kind of the overlap between physical disabilities and neurodiversity, and kind of how to create accessible things that can align with the needs of both. And so what we ended up doing was I actually had my dad etch these marbles. So the electron is just, there's no etching. The proton has a plus sign etched in it, and then the neutron has all the sides etched off, so that this could theoretically be also used if someone's blind, low vision. And so, but a lot of the students like having the tactile representations, and so they can use the marbles, count out the number of subatomic particles, and get a sense of how that works. Next slide. So like I said, this kind of started that, presenting at the Island Conference kind of started that conversation to see what else can we do to take accessibility things that were originally developed for individuals that are blind, low vision, and see how we can adapt them for neurodivergent students. And so after that, Carrie gave me a pretty big discount on the Talking LabQuest software. And so because it reads data off real time, and it also can read instructions off as well. And so, you can imagine that a student who's dyslexic, or someone who struggles with a language-based reading difficulty would really benefit from that potentially. And in the end, the student said that the idea of it was good. There would need to be some modifications, modulating the voice and stuff like that, and having more controls for that. But the idea was really useful. And I was talking to a student the other day about it, and she said, it just gave me more confidence to be in the lab and to be more comfortable. So, I think go to the next slide. But ultimately, I think it's important to consider the learning objectives. So I'm not assessing whether my students can read my labs, right? I'm assessing whether they can perform the labs. And so I think it's important to kind of say, what are you assessing, and what are the learning objectives? And if there's an accessibility, change or modification that you can make that's not compromising those learning objectives, then, and if it's fairly easy to do, then why not do it? Next slide. So like I said, this is just an example of thinking about, what are the learning objectives in the class, interpreting the instructions, performing the lab, and analyzing the data. But reading the instructions and collecting the data, those aren't necessarily learning objectives. Next slide. And so then, when you break that down, think about how you can adapt that and say those are the things that are reasonable accommodations if they're not being directly assessed. Next slide. So I also started a project on molecular visualization. I have visualization in quotes because originally I was working with MolStar, which is a visualization for proteins. But as I was working on this project to develop a case study about heme proteins, I said, well, why don't we 3D print the proteins and have that as an additional sensory experience, inspired by some of the work that I know Mona collaborates with Brian Shaw, kind of thinking about that work. And so we 3D printed the proteins, and then we realized, but the active sites are buried. So then what do we do? And so we said, let's cut the protein in half, because and then give people a better sense of what's happening with the active site. And so I brought some of those models with me. And so the students really liked the ability to see the proteins, and I haven't gotten the chance to do the physical models with my students that much, but when they were originally learning MolStar and all of the, it's a little bit of a complicated system. When they started doing all of that, then they said, it'd be really nice if we had tactile models to couple this with. And I'm like, I'm working on it. And so now I have them, thanks to a collaborator named Jana Villamain. I also have incorporated course-based undergraduate research experiences, cures into my classes, because they're, then every student gets to experience research in an authentic way that's built into, right now in my organic class, and I'm working on one for biochemistry. Next slide. And so, I ended up doing 2 pre-pilots with students to basically get a sense of what modifications would need to be made to make the laboratory protocols more inclusive. And so, things like detailed materials list, adding checked boxes so that the student is more easily able to, track where they are, and thinking about the wording, providing space in the text to do calculations and things like that. These aren't that hard to do in terms of, the formatting, but they can make a big difference in terms of the student focusing on the formatting and getting distracted by that, and really being able to focus on the lab running smoothly. Next slide. And then there's some additional things that we're going to be working on, including adding some visuals, color coding, and having more of a focus on the goals of the experiment and things like that. So really looking at how to make peers more inclusive. And so I have an example of the check boxes and kind of what the layout looks like. And ultimately, one of the big things for me is that these types of adaptations are really useful for the students to see the before and after, because then the hope is that if they're in an environment where they're not necessarily getting this format, they can think back and say, oh, you know what? If I had this format, it would be so much, it would align with my accessibility needs. And so I can do this myself. In the same way that, they might ask for a device similar to the Talking Lab Quest, because they now know that it exists. So a lot of it is exposure to, not everything's going to work for everyone, but at least they know that those things exist. Next slide. So I know that was a lot. I don't know how am I doing on time? Like I said, I talk fast. So, to summarize, I talked a little bit about my personal journey, which I didn't get into as much of the rockiness, but, I definitely had my highs and lows with chemistry. Talked a little bit about the NSF grant, AIE STEM, strategies to make the classroom formats more inclusive, and then some specific examples of inclusive curriculum. And so I like to end my talks with this slide because when I first started at Landmark, I had a dean at the time give me the advice that, you don't need to move the parking lot to make your classes more accessible. You don't need to go through and change everything about your classes. And if a student's asking you to do the equivalent of moving a parking lot, that's too much. But if you can just move a parking spot and make your class a little bit more accessible, that's reasonable. And that was a really powerful analogy for me. And so I took it from Jeff Burgess, who was the dean at the time, because I think it's something that we can all think about. You can click to think about how can you do little things to make your environments more accessible. And then I have a list of students and collaborators that I've worked with. Landmark also has classes to the certificate programs that I've completed. They have individual classes and certificates about learning about neurodiversity, executive function challenges, autism, and post-secondary disability services. And so that's something to check out. And I want to thank the Allied folks for inviting me. And then I think the last slide is just to turn it over for Q&A, and I have my contact information on there. If you scan that, it'll take you to my LinkedIn account. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you for giving such a detailed presentation. Love the concepts. And I'm sure most of our audience might have a few questions. Are you open to answering them?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead.
Can you expand more on, I really liked the connection between that making it accessible and for the neurodivergent students overlapped with making it accessible to a blind student. Can you explain how that came about? And
so Carrie Mona. So Carrie Paul is the type of person where if you ask a question, then suddenly you're collaborating with him. And I met him in 2016, so I had known him for a little bit. The island conference I went to was actually virtual, so I'm sitting in my bedroom watching talks about these different things because he had invited me to give a talk, and I said, Carrie, has anybody ever tested the Talking Lab Quest with neurodivergent students? And he goes, no, but we'd love to. And then, a couple of weeks later, he called me and said, let's do it. But
what made you think that though? You know what I mean? I think that's kind of almost societally speaking, we're not thinking yet that, hey, maybe accessible for one group could be accessible for the other. So that's the part that is intriguing to me. You're hey, this was designed for blind students to do chemistry in the lab, but hey, let's test it on neurodivergence.
I think it was mainly inspired by individuals with dyslexia to think about, the challenges with reading and just thinking about, and also dyscalculia or just getting overwhelmed by lots and lots of data and lots of numbers. So if the data is being recorded for you and you don't have to focus on that, or if you're getting that, and also that secondary stimulation. So when I originally worked with Cindy Tolman to write up the paper about the Bohr model and having that tactile cue, thinking about the ways in which we can build in those multimodal approaches was really something, and that's always kind of on my mind about, how can we give a different representation? How can we, connect with more students? And
did it help?
So I would say that, you could ask the students that are here because they were both with you when I was originally testing it, but I would say that the feedback I got was that the idea of it was useful, but they weren't, the voice was difficult to follow, the sort of monotone voice, and they said, we
update the voices with some of the more new voices.
Yes, yeah. So I gave that feedback to Carrie, and if he does another version of it, then including that type of thing to just make it more inclusive for more students. And a lot of the students said that it was kind of like having a virtual lab assistant where they could focus on doing the lab and not having to worry about some of the details that they might get overloaded with.
Thank you, Christine, for answering that. So we have a question from our online audience from Bridget Meiser. You mentioned a conference, Inclusion in Science, something of that sort. Can you repeat the name?
Yep, I'm just typing it in the chat.
Sure.
Inclusion in Science, Learning in a New Direction. The acronym is ISLAND.
And Ethan, I will be sharing the slides with you after the presentation. You can just leave your email. And as a former student, would you like to share anything about your experience?
Sure.
Oh, Dylan says he will. So Dylan can go first.
Okay. So yeah, my name's Dylan Sullivan. I graduated in May of 2024, so I'm a recent graduate. Professor Monroe and I actually came in at the same time, and all this information that Professor Monroe is talking about, it was an iterative process that I got to see firsthand, and it was I want to emphasize the effort and trial and error that went into like coming up with these adaptive strategies.
Yes,
And
please. Is there things?
can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
And Mona, to your point about like by making it inclusive for blind and low vision, you're also making it more inclusive for everyone. Like having a physical model serves everyone in the education process. I'm a huge champion of that. And my experience at Landmark in terms of inclusive teaching practices, it's opened my eyes to how important it is when Professor Monroe talked about the executive functioning model. What is content? Like the content itself offers challenge and understanding, but like the reading and writing aspect of it shouldn't be a barrier to entry. So it's like extrinsic versus intrinsic. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but
Extraneous versus extraneous cognitive load is like the things that are extra, but then there's the cognitive load focused on the content itself, which is the intrinsic load.
And the yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just the importance of it, like that recognition, like, okay, so I'm dyslexic and I struggle with reading and writing. It doesn't mean I should have any less an opportunity to engage with this information if there's an audio format, if there's an audio form of the same written text, I have that opportunity. So yeah, I struggled before Landmark. I went to 3 universities before finding Landmark. And this is a common story at Landmark. Like students will try at other universities and find they don't have the appropriate supports. A lot of the times it's just like base level, let's just not break the law for accommodations, which is it's the floor, not the ceiling. And Landmark is like starting to push those boundaries of what it means to be inclusive. So I've ended up flourishing at Landmark, and now my role is a neurodiversity specialist at another university.
Thanks. Becky, do you want to add it?
Sure. A lot of great points that Dylan made, and to read off some of them in my experiences. Landmark, you get a lot of really great mentors like Professor Monroe. And I mean, I think at least once a month, me and Dylan are talking every week. Professor Monroe comes up in some good light in the conversations. I went to a few different 3 colleges as well before Landmark, and then I had transferred to UVM about a year and a half ago from Landmark. And a lot of the things that Professor Monroe helped me figure out about my own disabilities, such as I like working in especially testing environments where I am like quiet in a dark space on my own. That was really helpful for me to figure out what would be best when I am at this much bigger university. And then especially seeing Professor Monroe with a lot of struggles of figuring out how to go from having a, 30-person class where you're grading everything by hand to figuring and going to the administration about let's do this other thing, helped me be inspired to be able to go to the accessibility department and say, you are not offering me this, that is a reasonable accommodation, I'm going to fight for something reasonable that would be really easy to add in, such as the private testing instead of a testing center that has a little bit more people in it or in the classroom. A lot of the things with like the audio learning device I found really helpful, other than the robotic voice, as someone with ADHD, because I have like multiple stimuli. So in the same way that Braille is just another form of reading that isn't visual, audiobooks and audio input is as well. And that is really helpful when anything with vision is impaired, whether it's just I am overwhelmed with information, I can't focus on reading, or I have something that like dyslexia or low vision that would affect that. And I found that really helpful. And one thing you didn't mention is how much you support community learning. And that is something that was absolutely amazing and I've never heard of anywhere else. And
Can you describe what that is?
yeah, so the way we did it a lot of times was I kind of ran a study group that informally met more often than we were supposed to meet in a conference room, and a group of us would all have the same assignments because we're in the same class, and we'd have someone projecting it up on the board, and we'd all kind of work through the problem. If anyone was struggling, we would help them with it until they understood it, and since there were multiple of us there, we could help be like, cool, I'm gonna try to draw this in this way, I'm gonna add this metaphor in until the person understands it, just because different people explain it different. Or we run down the hallway and ask Professor Monroe for help. Sometimes that, and it made it just, you're more engaged in the work. It's a more supportive environment, and then there's a lot more ways of understanding it, and that was something that you supported a ton, and that I think more places need to incorporate it to accessibility because it's more accessible for everyone.
And did you design these communities, like assign, like, here is your community, you will work with these people, or is it an organic thing?
An organic thing. Actually, Becky doesn't give herself enough credit because she came to me and she said, I want to organize a study group. And so I said, okay, let's make it happen. So let me help you find a space. Let me help you sort of do some of the like logistical things so that you can focus on bringing this community of people together to learn. I will say that, you know, I've seen a variety, even the short time that I've been at Landmark, of different strategies for that. So sometimes I just say, you know, come to my office hours and just sit in the classroom and be in that academic environment. And students will just come and sit. I also have, I have 4 student interns right now, and all of them are working on different projects, but I can't focus enough to actually like supervise one-on-one as much. So I basically say, all of you should come and just like be in the same space. So now I have other students that aren't even interns or that are not getting paid, but they just kind of show up and help with things just to create that, like, again, that cohort experience. The cohorts don't naturally form at Landmark because students are transferring in, so they might be coming in with credits. They might also be going at a different pace through courses, and so we kind of have to be a little bit more deliberate about helping to form those cohorts.
Mm-hmm. Right, because it's not like everybody enters at the same time and you have your RA group and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. And the other thing is we're looking at writing a grant for a learning assistant program to actually have students help more with both curriculum development and peer mentoring. Our bachelor's program in biology is only 4 years old. Before that, we only had an associate's program. And so, you know, we're learning as we go. And the students are awesome because, you know, I would say our faculty is pretty humble in terms of saying, I'm going to try something and maybe it's going to work and maybe it's not going to work. And let me get feedback from students about it. And so it's really a collaborative environment and the students are involved in that collaboration, which I think is pretty unique. I've talked to other professors like, you get that much feedback from students about what's working and not working. I'm like, yeah. I know there's a question online and they've been very patient, so I don't want to.
Thank you so much, Christine, for answering the questions. I think Eric Brenner raised his hand. Do you have any question, Eric?
You're muted. Just
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let me just add you on Twitter.
Thank you, Dr. Monroe. It's always great to hear anyone from Landmark speak about this. I'm with the Neurodiversity initiative here on Northeastern, and a big focus of what we do is the professional development around faculty. And Bridget on the call with us right now is really active in that professional development. And could you tell us more about how Landmark ensures that the faculty are like you, perhaps, are implementing or knowledgeable of neuro-inclusive, or we call it universal design, which is inclusion for all, in their class?
So I will say I started at a really weird time, and I didn't get as much faculty training. Actually, a lot of the training that I got was from Upward Bound and the like having the direct connection with students, and really seeing students as people, which sometimes it's, you know, when you're overwhelmed with grading and all the things that go along with being an academic, it's hard to remember that. But Landmark, the courses that I mentioned through the Landmark College Institute of Research and Training, they are free to all faculty. And after 3 months, you can start taking them. In addition, I would say that it's a lot of learning by doing, and, you know, having faculty members like Rebecca Maddie, who I mentioned is my co-PI. She's been at Landmark for 25 years, collaborating with her and just kind of like sitting next to her and just learning from her. We have, I think, Sue Vincent is here also from Landmark. You can, and you're newer than I am, you can speak, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would say that it's the collaborative nature of the faculty at Landmark. And, you know, when one faculty member is struggling and they're like, I don't know how to deal with this particular situation, we can go to other faculty members and also advisors. So the advising staff is really awesome at Landmark. One of the things that's really nice is when you have a situation that you're kind of like, I don't know how to communicate with the student, or there's some kind of breakdown, you can pick up the phone and call their advisor and say, hey, could we have a conversation? Can you give me a little bit more insight into the best strategies for communicating with the student? And that's a really big plus as well. So I think that those are the things that, and just learning from other people's strategies. We, you know, I mean, I was given a faculty mentor when I started, Kim Coleman, and her office is right next to mine. I feel a little bad for that because I'm always in her office being like, what do I, you know, what do I do here? But I think it's that just like collegial environment, learning both from the Institute for Teaching and Learning, but then also from each other. Which I don't really know how to recreate at another institution, but that's, you know, we're very lucky to have the experienced faculty that are so willing to coach and mentor.
And I think I jump in here too and say one thing that I feel like we do well at Landmark is we encourage our students to approach us and to advocate for themselves, and that's huge.
I forgot that. We learned so much from our students. Yeah, I mean, that's the other piece of it, is just, you know, my first semester at Landmark was really rough because I was learning and I was doing some things that my students were like, this isn't helpful to me. And so I listened to that. And I also told them, I'm like, I'm not necessarily going to be able to listen to it in the moment, but come next semester, I'm going to incorporate that, like giving lists of vocab. So it's about saying, okay, you know, how can I continually improve, and looking at that as growth opportunities. But yeah, the students, a lot of it is just being open to getting feedback from students, and you know, hearing from them to say, oh, you know, you should tweak this or tweak that, and then you start to get into a rhythm. And you know, a lot of times it's like, and creating that comfortable kind of laid back environment that the students feel comfortable enough to come to you and say, hey, this isn't working, and you know, exploring that as well.
And you want to add?
Something between Landmark and UVM, which is significantly larger than Landmark that I went to.
Just a little bit.
How big is Landmark? How many students?
About 500.
Yeah.
500 students.
So
Yeah.
the semester the semester after Professor Monroe started when I did, we had 350 during COVID, and then about 2 years later it was at 450. Like, yeah, did a lot of student affairs stuff. But yeah.
What were you gonna add?
So a lot of it too is just the professors at Landmark don't treat the classes as just, I have to get this information to students, where it's a, cool, I'm gonna do 50 lectures and they're gonna just sit and watch this lecture and maybe they can ask questions, where it's just purely I'm throwing information at you. It's a much more of a personal thing of like, there are some interactive pieces, listening to that student feedback and being open from the start of that I am someone you can approach. And it's something that can be really hard for professors in larger universities where they have a class of 100, 200 students to be like, how do I do that? But I've had professors at UVM that had very similar styles of teaching, even though they had to do tons of lecture slides for a purely memorization class, like physiology or anatomy, but they were still able to incorporate that, and from the beginning were like, come to me if something's not working, we'll find ways to add more iClicker questions, add more interactive, I'll pass around something in the classroom that's more physical so you can have that touch aspect or something like that. And there's ways of doing that I think Landmark prioritizes.
Is it as simple as that though? Like, come to me if you have questions, because I feel like every professor should say that. Like, what else is it that makes you comfortable?
Professor says that to the degree of they have to have office hours at pretty much every university. But beyond that, also just like being a little bit more casual with the students. I'm not just this professional person that is giving you information. I'm another person too. Like, here's a picture of my dogs the first day. I had a professor at UVM that would show a little fun, she called them, I think, bites, daily bites, and they were fun facts and that semi-related to the class, not really, that she would share that were just kind of fun.
So just be human.
Yeah, basically, students are humans, faculty are human, that's.
I think also open, right? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like there are some professors that are just like, I can't wait to get this over with.
And if I could jump in here too, I'd say a connection. We have a really good rapport with our students. We're connected. We call it a sense of belonging. And it allows students to find you approachable, to find you human. We had attended a conference last week, and in it, Christin said, you could ask the students what their input is, and people were sort of looking at it like, ask the students, and they actually said it. I mean, ask the students, and we both sat back and thought, oh, we're out of our element. We would ask our students, whereas other people, they had so much content or so many students that they couldn't hear from them all. So that's another thing that I feel like we do really well. And Dylan, I think you're still there somewhere. I can't see you, but Becky was before my time. Isn't that fun to say? So Dylan actually taught me a few things, and I had Dylan my first semester teaching at Landmark. And I think one of the things that I remember is Dylan was talking about reading, and that he didn't like to do a lot of reading, so he came and spoke to me really early on. And I think it was you, Dylan, that said you like to walk and listen to the textbook.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was huge for me because I was thinking, wow, they don't just have to sit, and listen to the textbook, to be out and active. And then you guys are doing so much more. You might be texting somebody and listening to the textbook or exercising, so that was really huge. And then you came to me, maybe at least 3 times, and you were helping me to step it down and figure out a way to work with you. And then we came up with a way that was very unique to Dylan only, and nobody else was doing it. Do you remember that?
I do. That's such a gift of the time I had at Landmark, was like the collaborative effort. And something else that's beautiful is that you're with students who think differently. It comes back to like making an accommodation for one student can help all students. Like, if you have your text in multiple formats, I know I've said this, but if you have it in multiple formats, you're giving more opportunity for the student to engage with that same information. So it just makes it easier to access.
And I also say one more thing about something that they said, is that the beginning of the semester, like, the student knows themselves best, and most students and professors are both intimidated by sending or receiving an email that says, hey, these are what I struggle with, can we try to find a way to work around this if it comes up? A lot of times, for me, just as an example, I'll email the professor and say, hey, I struggle with getting homework in on time. And it's like, I can explain to you why if you want to know more, but it doesn't mean I don't understand the material. And I usually just need a little bit more time and flexibility about just when the homework gets in, and I'm happy to send updates, and it will all get in at the end. Or it may not look like I'm focusing in class. If I have some silly video game on my computer during class, it means I'm actually focusing more. And even though it may look like I'm not paying attention. And that can be a little bit like, oh, well, now I don't trust the student because they're not gonna return in homework, so maybe they're just lazy. Or why should I care about this one student? I have 200. But being willing to receive that, and also being even telling the students, like, if you have anything that you maybe struggle a little bit with or need a little bit of help with, or you just want to explain how you work, I'd be happy to just listen and just to make sure we're on the same page and be flexible and saying that from the start so that things are a little bit easier on the communication aspect.
I cross-stitch through every meeting I go to, and I'm very open with my students about the fact that I get it. If, I've had students that have like apologetically come to me and they're like, I just want to let you know, I require all my students, whether I've had them once or, 5 times, to come to my office hours at the beginning of the semester, because I think that having that first interaction that's not a stressful interaction, they're not coming to me because they're panicking about the class, they're just coming to me to like get to know me. And I tell my students, I'm like, I get it. So if they come to me and they say, oh, I'm sorry if I'm doodling, that's just how I focus. I'm like, that's how I focus. And if I wasn't doing something with my hands, I'd probably be talking the whole meeting or distracted or emailing or just doing something else. So cross-stitching for me is my thing that like keeps me busy enough to be able to focus. So being able to relate to the students and be open about that, and instead of it being this like secret, it's like, I mean, it's not a secret because everybody pretty much knows that. But yeah, so it's things like that too. But thank you, Dylan and Becky, for being put on the spot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so
That
much.
was so great.
Thank you, Becky and Dylan, for sharing your experience. I think we are a little ahead of time, so I would like you guys to stop here. And Christine, thank you so much for sharing about such influential work at Landmark. We would love to collaborate again with Landmark University for any of our future events. So
Yeah,
on that note, we have another event coming up really soon. That is on 8th of November. And we're going to be having a guest speaker named Michael Fricky. And
Fricky's coming.
He's coming to Landmark on the 5th.
Yeah.
He's driving past Landmark. He's like, I'll stop by Landmark too.
And the periodic table is gonna end up in my office.
That's awesome.
You should come again.
And he's gonna be talking about the Braille periodic table, a really interesting topic. So you guys can join us here same time, 2 to 3 p.m. in ISIC room 332. All our events are hybrid as well. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Andrea and Amy, who are our new ASL interpreters. Thank you so much for being so patient and collaborating with us. And thank you all the audience for being so engaging.
What I want to make one more announcement. So Michael Fricky is actually coming on the 8th, and in that morning, if you're interested to learn about arsenic, then also come to his other talk that will be in EXP, I think at 10 a.m. Information, we'll send it out. Or 11 a.m.
Thank you, everyone. That's a wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today on the Allied's YouTube channel. We hope you find today's conversation inspiring and gain new insights into creating a more inclusive STEM environment for neurodivergent individuals. If you enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Monroe, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on any of our future talks. Together, let's keep advocating for diversity and innovation in STEM. See you next time.